I just said it right. So that's my
Is there a shock chain going on there?
There's not, because we're just flashing. But I'm sure you could just get the flash drive.
You go with Global?
Huh?
You go with Global?
I am. Still with Global. Couple more years.
At least.
Or at least I'll get the lovely
Oh.
pieces done. It'll happen one day.
Yeah, where is frozen and stuff?
What?
Oh, just my word is frozen.
Yeah, a couple of. Or actually, this year I'll be done. But
Really?
Speaking of that, Chris, I don't know if you noticed.
I saw there were some GA shows coming open, you know. Gender studies look real nice in IU. I'm exploring options. I'm probably going to re-explore the GRE first, but I'm going to explore options.
Fair enough.
You can take the GRE.
Yeah.
Taking the GRE.
I'm gonna need a score that's a little bit higher on the PhD programs.
What? Not saying. Not saying. I'd say you're for sure taking a year off. Well, not a year off, but like, not. Yeah.
Good. All right, one.
That's what a lot of people have told me, except for this one recently finished PhD student who was like, you need to get out and get a job as fast as you possibly can.
Do you think we could resave it? Because for some reason,
Yeah.
it just like corrupts or whatever for me. Yeah, sure. It might be on my computer, but. Yeah. Oh,
Yes.
yes.
We can go talk about Pokemon International. The dream.
So you just want me to resave it? Yeah, please.
Oh, good throw.
Thank you. I mean, that's all right. I was right into your
I was gonna say, yeah, I haven't seen that.
It was perfect. It was the perfect throw.
Calling you out, man.
Yo, it's really not open for me. Email maybe? Yeah, let's do that. Alright, let's do email. Do you want it? Max with 2 T's.
You want?
743.
I'll scrap the on email.
Okay.
Good, just so you go.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, Stuart. Microsoft and idea kind of. What's up? Not a lot of ideas. Doing an over.
There's a lot going on.
I'm just really invested in the fact that there are 3 Lenovo here.
Alright,
Watch out. Lenovo's taking over.
There's 3 Macs.
It works.
There's 3 files.
Should we just, do you want me to put everyone on the chain or do you prefer the jumping? Are you connected to the internet?
Yeah, I'm just working on the chain for
I don't know. Like, we could keep doing both. Huh?
Yeah, we'll see for the next time.
Alright, yeah.
Let's figure that one out later.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone ready?
Yeah.
Alright.
Splendid. White supremacist polarizations continually threaten to reduce identity to dyads, either an antagonistic position towards structures of oppression and other individuals surrounding us, or the reinvocation of static ossified categories. Michael Suo is from a Chinese family that immigrated to the United States. He is marked in the American racial code as foreign and other, and yet within the logic that dominant regimes of racialization deployed, he's still, so they say, doing comparatively well. The long history of racial oppression in America makes it obvious this isn't true. The brutal explosibility of Chinese workers, Chinese exclusion, the murder of Vincent Chen, the myth of the model minority coexists with a violent suspicion of Asian otherness. Prostitution restrictions emerged against the image of seductive Asian man threatening the purity of white European womanhood. Weed restrictions drew above the rhetorical economy. The Chinese opium scare combines with the new xenophobia framed around Mexican invasion, creating new regimes of violence. His contingent, his historical moments become sedimented through representations of reaffirmation of politics against other groups like Black Americans, Asian migrants, and novel ways. Discussion of race needs to stay as creative as the individuals who bear it. When it remains within a binary, all people of color be stuck in the white supremacist system, all common sex, green Americans deny the social category of income. And most of us the time they subject for scapegoating and political paradigm, racism, capable theoretical and political addressing racism among communities of color. It's not all about white people, but only white supremacists, but deny agencies, other groups, but the dominance increasing racism, multiple targets, about variety of forms because black white paradigm, racialized groups like Latinos, Asian Americans, Americans and Native Americans are marginalized, black white persons, power various groups begin to find their own identity markers, different captions, and limited property of identity. Description voiced upon from the outside is problem two reasons. First, self-fairly exclude, and second, consider the weakening analysis of races by limiting specificities, limiting non-group black white binary. Undercut the possibility of political solution with variable forms of racial oppression and black white paradigm proposes. To understand all conflict communities, culture, anti-black races, and white supremacy when the reality is much more complex than binary. Produce an imaginary which parallels white majority confronts a small black minority, reinforcing the sense of inevitability, white domination thinking race only. In terms of black minority, produces a sense of inevitability, white domination, thus fatalism, even facts call for the opposite affects people's choices. And their political activism, quick race for politics. And it seems that the all races of the black minority lined up between them continues not along, but not the only acts of religious ideas that the Asian Americans eventually become white, person the assumption of to trust white black groups not politically located at a bottom society which the paradigm associates with exclusively black and such groups assume to have achieved whiteness in the silence that's spread by reducing racialization and simplicity, allows conservative forces to divide and conquer the model minority myth. The tale of the high-performing Asian who proves at social level is possible is a paradigmatic example of a liminal identity being redeployed as a weapon for Shah II. If African Americans did not receive the reference of injustice in history, Africa itself is further exposed neoconservative priesthood discourse de facto racism in the state framework, which just tried to manage racist socioeconomic relations, permanent action rather than racism to bear the burden of social development to the Asian American. That's a single useful way to attack the problem back when phrase in terms of over-representation. These minorities will be heard. These social engineering said they were already over-represented, perfected two, that face quotations are using this incident as a weapon against redistribution process. State selection endows us with an arrogance about merit and ability without any historical knowledge of the courts of produce in order to come back to my state policy itself and divisiveness for its culture. As a unifying what's important to offer an account of the affirmative privilege obscured by the pornography Asian Americans using an instrument to show how these schools discriminate against. Asian Americans are in private schools where the Asian Americans discriminate against the favorite whites with no sounds of the problem of affirmative privilege. You should go to affirmative to affirmative pedagogy of polyculturalism obliterating the strength of the black white binary gives to white supremacy is neither embracing liberal multicultural colorblindness nor advocating the primordial position of absolute difference between races. We begin instead with an understanding of race the complex phenomenon that it is for Shah II. The problem of the 21st century, the problem of the colorblind police to redress race, and we need not consider race in social practice. We are told to be above race, colorblind justifies private privilege. The justice prioritizing inequality and racism removes itself from the project anti-racist justice is genteel racism our new millennium against king colorblindness general least arguments way to argue things must remain safe. Colorblindness includes the structures that practice excellence racism kind of primordialism. With too much stake in race primordial disease races both people organized by the code of the stand by genetic predisposition most viral practitioners of this or the white supremacy the fascist race Ku Klux Klan other responses organization boutique multiculturalism reduced to different ways of superficial tokens where people engage with those parts of difference they will when they disagree they want the fun but not the fundamentalism and authenticity should not be a justification for exclusion. Polycultural politics affirms the centrality of internal differentiation for any understanding of identity. Rather than viewing our affirmative as either the inscription of Michael's scholarship into my white world, we juxtapose our positionalities and ask about the possibilities. This generates, if there's any value in debate to begin with, it must start from the presupposition of non-exclusion for Shah II. Disintegration for white supremacy, many people currently on narrow national security. The most obvious strategy is to ask for resources based on authenticity. We need to be represented by our arguments on a people principle because it calls for redress and past Asian American students need Asian American faculty members, Asian American studies, race is used in life historical category consider categories of invasive racism in the past, and therefore the function to exclude certain people to gain redress race has to be essential since those basic racism and disintegration took place. The strategy of redress is limited, like it's entrapped in the fabric of bourgeois law. The onus on those who have been historically oppressed to solve the problem remedy the standard for redress and close rather high to counter the injudicious high standards. Many of the terms of question of cultural authenticity lives in multiculturalism, the assumption that culture is discrete bachelor. The strategy of cultural amends leads to a housing war of all against the oppressed, the divided rule. World strategy comes to pass many times. Reference to insignificant groups such as Amerindians do not have access to this political strategy. The appeal often transforms the student into a consumer, makes a market-based defense by opposing the moral structure, social justice, cultural authenticity, is defensive gesture against white supremacy set institutions. All of us, I mean all of us, are the inherited European, African, Native American, Asian past, even if we can't exactly trace our bloodlines. Those comments rejecting racism with the distance our various cultures never easily identifiable sphere in their bounds include all people culture is a process no identifiable words never know no culture can act claim a private interest in history or authentic culture even though people form appear to be relatively discrete groups. South Asians, African Americans, Latino Americans, most of us live with the knowledge that the boundaries of our communities are fairly porous. Multicultural intents for the static view of history with cultures already forged and when people enjoy, respect, and tolerate each other. Both polyculturalism on the other hand offers a dynamic view of history mainly because it argues for cultural complexity. These examples are not random, but they enable us to indulge one of the traits of polycultural approach to snub the pretension of the United States which arrogates certain parts of the world knowledge to itself. They're representing its ideas at the top of cultural hierarchy, leaving the rest of us to end up with the legacy of colonial knowledge and knowledge with our meager economic and cultural resources to the primordialists. It says that to deny internal differentiation, intermixture of cultural forms does not provide the adequate agenda. Dismantle status quo kept in place. Like the colorblindness of authenticity includes the privilege of broad anti-racist platform, but not like little multicultures that invest itself in the management of difference, but with the struggle to dismantle racist structures. The answer to American ideology then comes against a language of scheme that not in a colorblind fashion. Polyculture does not posit undifferentiated humans inherently equal. Instead, it concentrates on the question of creator humanity. Human is an unfinished project. One divided by social force must be overcome for humans when they manifest and growing. Grass means affirming the multiplicity of identity. Identity should become multiple, where the tree of identitarian totality once stood. Thousands of molecular identity should sprout till dawn in 6. Every time phenotype makes another machinic connection, there's a stutter. Every time bodies are further entrenched in segregation, however brutal, there needs to be an affective investment. This is the ruptural mode in which to intervene. Race should not be eliminated but proliferate. What is needed is an affirmation of race's creativity and virtuality. What race can be, race need not be about order and oppression. It can be wild, far from equilibrium, living towards not that everything becomes completely brown. It's just that what's premises man that becomes strenuous as many populations start harboring a similar economic, technological, cultural productivity as whites do now, linking all sorts of bodies with all sorts of wealth and all sorts of ways of life. There's no race but inferior minoritarian. There's no dominant race but molecularization. Race for consistent breaking up into 1,000 tiny races. Machinists against racism built upon a graphical, fragmented, corporeal difference that extends further than the street understanding. The geographical differentials that exist between many different kinds of bodies, between a Jew and a black soldier, between a woman in Sodom and a woman in Wall Street, and a Peruvian peasant, and a Chinese journalist. May seem the machinist is utopian, it's empirical, but it's empirical, limited, pragmatic, culture studies, preoccupation with apology, recognition, political correct life, and reconciliation, trying to stand in the way of really doing something. Ethics and competence, politics, and politics starts with convince people of race and materiality of process such as race, critical, with classical notions of identity, causality, cognitive representation, reducibility. Race requires a theory that understood a critical dialogue facilitated by modern ontological philosophy theory of molecular energies. Race can be sensed, understood, and harnessed from a systemic bonds, permanently keeping our bodies in place, hoping for 1,000 tiny races, not annihilating nature from culture, but immersing oneself in nature's lines of play, understand what race is, know its potentialities, and try to sense them, hide and find out what's keeping them from becoming actual. And why? You affirm because critique and negativity are not the same thing. Melancholia and mourning have become the hallmarks of our context, and as a result, critiques of domination have stalled. Affirmation is the only way out of a stifling paradox between negativity as critique and activating affect as a modality for change, bright, dotty, and nine. A paradox is how to engage in affirmative politics, which entails the production of social varieties of hope while doing critical theory, which means resisting the present. Central to this debate is the question of how to resist the present nastiness, balance, and vulgarity of our times so as to engage in an oppositional and affirmative manner. Biopolitical concerns that fuels our necropolitics and colonial warfare of our times, also just a political economy of negative passions in our social context. The conceptual case for affirmation relates to the rejection of traditional equation between political subjectivity and critical consciousness. There is an implicit assumption of political subjectivity about resistance, and the resistance means the negation of the negativity of the present being against, and the plus of belligerent acts of negation of paradoxical commitments is thus positively now which one rejects the discourse of political philosophy results happening. Negativity is a paradox of consciousness raising is crucial. Overturning or overcoming the negatives. This is resulted in a simplistic equation between critique and negativity. The reduction of the latter to negation. A subject ethical core is a process of engendering empowering modes. Becoming the work of critique must not assume that the condition for the overturning of negativity are necessarily available. Move beyond the dialectic plot means abandoning oppositional thinking. To think means to create new concepts. To disengage the process of subject formation from negativity to attachment. To an affirmative otherness means that reciprocity is redefined as not as mutual recognition, but rather as a mutual definition or specification. We are in this together in a vital political economy that's both transsubjective and transhuman and enforce what is positive. And the ethics of affirmation believes that negative affects can be transformed. Every event contains within the possibility and potential for being overcome and overtaken. Its negative chance to be transposed. Affirmative ethics put the motion back into emotion, the act back into activism, or reduced to the process of becoming negative passion not merely destroy itself, but also harm itself's capacity to relate to others. Negative affect diminish our capacity to express the high levels of interdependence and utter reliance on others. That's both the key to an undetermined vision of the subject of the affirmative ethics in the first place. And this is why they should neither be encouraged nor should we be rewarded for lingering too around too long. This produces a number of significant shifts from negative to affirmative ethics, from entropy to generative desire, from being comprehensible to virtual events to be actualized, from evidence teachers outside to any geometry of access requires mutual actualization and synchronization, from a melancholy and a split to an open-ended web-like structure, from the epistemology to the ontological turn and post-structuralist philosophy.
What does he have to do?
Well, I mean, there are, I guess, multiple answers to that question. One thing that the app does is put forward a claim about how individuals who come from potentially different cultural situations and geographic situations can create a hybrid politics of resistance against white supremacists and capitalism. Well, I think it looks like the one I see. It's a mode of scholarship and affirmation, which we think resists a sort of dominating and totalizing tendency in sort of contemporary politics.
Okay, how does it resist that shit?
Well, I mean, our argument is that whiteness and capitalism right now function and maintain dominance by controlling creativity and what constitutes possible ways of actualizing self. The affirmative is a new mode of creatively affirming a different conception of self.
You talk a lot about, like, you know, how some people of color can be inextricably caught up in whiteness and can reinforce that shit. And then another part of the app is just like exclusion bad. Why is it bad for us as people of color to exclude other people of color who do direct harm to us?
Well, the point is that whiteness as a structure, or sort of more specifically the assemblage that is whiteness, capitalism, heteronormativity, etc., makes certain individuals or certain groups into agents of violence against other groups. It allows a sort of Hobbesian war of all against all among oppressed groups, which means that they can't attack the structure itself because they're too busy fighting each other.
I've like heard this one piece of evidence where it's like we're all in this together. What does that mean?
It means that fundamentally we can't absolve ourselves of responsibility to or responsibility for other struggles against oppression. What does that mean?
Well, it means that we're constantly affected by both your politics and our politics. We're engaged in
How are
sort
you
of
affected by my politics? works.
Well, because affect is simply a question of how desire and activity move between
Is
individuals
your
and
argument that
bodies.
the one AC was effective?
Affective, maybe not effective.
No, that's
That'll
what I
be the
meant.
debate.
That's what I
What?
meant.
Affective?
Yeah, why? Literal
I mean,
speech is a way of generating affect.
we
But is
can't.
affect refer to invoking an emotional response?
Not necessarily. It's
What
kind of a
is affect?
simplistic reading of affect. Affect is simply the ability of an individual to engage in a type of sort of affirmative, world-changing behavior. We think we are that, although it's true that there's no ability to determine like whether an affect is successful.
All right, why don't you have to interrogate your privilege as a white male student that attends Harvard?
I did.
How?
I think I do by also reading this affirmative. This is
By
also
just reading
Michael's
the app.
argument. What?
By just reading the app.
No, there are parts
I
in
mean,
the
what is
YC.
interrogating privilege? Like, is he supposed to confess like every bad thing he's ever? I think that the one we see is a productive mode of politics that can move us forward. Like,
Move us forward where?
move us forward to a world perhaps without the various forms and modalities of oppression.
Do you really think that's possible?
I think that we should hold open its possibility. We shouldn't give up on that.
But what does that do of being open to possibilities in a world in which material violence is inevitable?
Material violence.
Seems
Material
bad.
violence
It's
is
not inevitable. There's nothing inevitable about
And
it.
material violence
You
is
to
also
say that.
not the same everywhere. Like, material violence has many different kinds and types and gradations.
Yeah, we can.
Actually, I did.
It's all paper.
Yeah. Hold on.
I'm not sure this paper is weird with cat nature in it. No. That's
You good?
Yeah.
All good. We were taught to love the men in our lives, but never ourselves. They tell me to find beauty in submission, repress my sexuality, obsess over my differences, make my marginal status the pornography sites that get you off your map on of all directions, pull me from all sides without even attempting to understand mine, compare and contrast that limits the watered down, try stereotypes determine my worth and disproportionately asking me if my hips lie, as if my hips could convey truths, and my hips of the body to tracks that have ever even been valued, only touched, inflicted, marks, loathed, and thrown away after you nut, after I satisfy, sacrifice, and accept, and that I will never be anything more than food for your thirsty, bleeding eyes, and after I take upon myself to have sexual agencies to make sure I know how irredeemable my soul is, but where is yours accepting me to tear the threads, the fine lines that you create that never navigate? A lady in the streets, a freak in the sheets, I'm neither, but regardless of how I feel, regardless of how many times I tell you that your embarrassing attempts to speak Spanish in front of me do not flatter me. If you took the time to get to know me, you would know that the language was denied from me, stripped away in the ESL classroom. What does it mean to be a strong Latina woman when even the Latinas in my life are just guilty and reinforcing these expectations as a trashy white man yelling mamacita in front of across the street? I am expected to be everything and nothing, a virgin and a whore, nothing more, nothing less than selfishness, readily sexual available, that they tie me down to their traditions and now never say that I'm the ball that changed the bitch who's giving you a migraine when you have never even had the once you attempt to scrutinize your own racist, misogynistic family vows that teach me and so many others to hate our bodies and our feelings feelings, sacrificing our right to feel, so that your structure within a structure of colonialism and a shitload of other isms which imprisons literally spiritually and fugitivity over the body being not moved right along. We must be careful as we get not in the way, so that the world may spin right along. While we let to spin by ourselves, we live in silence, we die in silence on the streets and inside of ourselves, as we are sold and narratives are superficial happiness that can grasp if and only if we find a man that ultimates approves of our success and other values. Marinoism means never being unhappy with your man, no matter what he does to you. Keep in mind that he is not yours, but instead you or his, and sex is meant to have babies and not meant to for pleasure. We were never meant to be pleasured. We exist solely to pleasure, then to obey inside, outside, and in between all spaces. No spaces is ours. There is no such thing as personal space for women of color, or no organs in this brown body is mine. These organs, these hips are very the nugs that you break down, so that you can get a cheap hit and deeply inhale as you swallow your pride and puff your masculinity, scrutinize to reach the temporal height that we cannot give you. And after you hit our pipes, we are ones of the shame to ourselves, making that shame, internalize that shame, because Latina women are taught to never discuss our personal problems outside of the house, as if our oppression is our problem. This is more than just a problem. This is a day-to-day trauma. This is more. This is many for us to not speak out against, because many of us are spoken for, because many of us are too afraid to speak. Selena is saying the beautiful words of her life, taught a young woman like mine, falling in love is the way out, but what is good is falling in love with another. We've seen love do more damage than good, when love's always been laid out before us. Therefore, I can be free. Littleton, 2012. The fact that she's even writing today's society's revolutionary, that Chicana is saying no. By doing this, she becomes the source to change. She's humanizing herself to the experience as she validates the importance of a personal being, the political, and not ensure her own survival to others like her. She creates a pathway of queer narratives to pass through, referring to all narratives to break down the patriarchy, Eurocentric, heterocentric, capitalist, and interline models that storytellers and experience. We predict our hopes and dreams towards survival and change as the first made into language, into the idea, into more tangled actions. Poetry neither is a luxury for women of color. Women of color have neither economic security nor leisure time to write poetry and about topics that are not directly related to life experience. Writing is a sign of our is not a sign of our privilege. It is a proof for our existence, and that when we repeat, strengthen, and fight for survival, breaking the silence becomes a collective act, because a significant overcoming, freeing oneself of all confines of conditions of history. We write so that we can be remembered, and remember and we write as resistance the faction of being unremembered. I feel, therefore, I can be free as long as we connect to poetry. Freedom is possible. Each word we breathe is potential and a hinge. Our bodies are colonialized, replace the spots within the love of our own creations. A Chicana's role in the academic is to look into the gaps, lapse, and absence of masculine discourse that we have written women out of the historical agencies. Project that the recovery means that writing out has political. I consider writing a political responsibility. I write to prove my identities matter. More importantly, that exist the domains ideologically, the historians to attempt to exclude political, sociable, and the papers write out my voices and voices forth from the past. And the white dude over there doesn't get a free pass just because this is his partner's path. White people are not always trusted, which means interrogating privilege is necessary to act on for you to participate in. If you are combat structures of oppression, this is not virtually confession or approach of the one I see to attempt to systematically mislead people of color. Campbell 97 discord, the sites of both power and knowledge means that speech acts are inherently dangerous. A person in privilege proceeding has a political ethical responsibility to integrate his or her relationships in the disadvantaged people and declare their interests assumes that subjectivity camouflages not only the fact that the racist standpoint, but is also subversive of ideological purpose, refusing that the declare of one speaking position could change that the flatter denies of the privilege affects the speech must be considered as an act of contemplated systematic misled. Before I speak, I require to undertake a process of self-examination and to scrutinize the representation of politics that discourse of what I am politics the authorities who are who at ease. Within the process of reflection, I am required to examine the context local from which I speak in order to assert rather it is analyze with the structure of the repression and analyze with the resistance of oppression. And poetry is a better method of performance. It allows by the same very people that made us to hate us. We do not know how to fall in love with ourselves. Middleton, 2012. The space in which we fall in love is a space where we always are connected to the earthly dominance of the man made by the Christ. We fall in love into the knowledge protections of the area of the consciousness that direct a feeling rather than feelings moral or fear of the love of revolutionary decolonized. This love is not narrative of love and culture in the West. It is a protection of products through the traditional older narratives of love raptures every day, drifting bodies, movements outside between the narratives, forms of the free, unmarked to the rooms, spaces as sites, drifting, morphing to meaning, and the transformations to let us in. Counter narratives, products of queer women of color, the practice groups of falling in love again and again as they resist by labeling the existing.
Ready?
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess the first question is why vote nay?
I vote nay, because we have performantly, performed in this debate space. Also,
So the question should be which performance was a better one?
Yeah.
Okay. So the second argument, which is sort of a significant part of the poetry argument, is this notion that writing allows for sort of contestation of the dominant scripts, of ways that people are understood, allows for sort of freedom inside of history.
It's very important for women of color. Like it's very important. It's a key to survivability for women of color because it allows us that it's the only way we can speak and have our voice heard, and that's very key. And the fact that you don't.
What I was going to ask is why does our politics preclude the possibility that you sort of write your freedom in various ways?
The way y'all perform, the way that you don't have poetry, the way that
why is us not having verse a reason why Latina women
because Latin right because the intersect the way the act is, it like blocks out like women of color, and that means that like it's important.
Just simply because we didn't read a woman of color, or
No,
why
just like
did
you
we
don't engage like with it.
What?
Read a woman of color.
Like poetry from
Yeah.
a woman of color.
So like I think that it's like a little bit more than like not being poetry for me. I think that there are two that I would say. I think that the way in which we're sort of accessing this internal link to excluding women of color is the not acknowledging white privilege argument.
Okay, so
I
that
also
links back to this.
Yeah, I also think that the next argument I was going to do is just like neutral approaches and stances towards women of color do not work out well for women of color.
I agree. Well, that makes sense. Why? So the whiteness argument. The Campbell evidence says that sort of flagrant denial of the privileging effect of speech is bad. One must declare one's speaking position. I guess what constitutes a necessary or effective declaration of self? Like what? How much do I need to say? I guess is what I'm saying.
I mean, just acknowledging that you're a white male is very important. And
Well,
the fact that
But
because
I
I'm
did
a
that.
woman,
So what?
I don't think you did that right, especially the fact that I am a woman of color, and that it's very important for white males to acknowledge that, to
Yeah,
make
I
me
agree.
feel comfortable, or not even just comfortable, but allow myself to talk about what I talk about.
Right. And like
In what ways have we stopped
Yeah,
that? Sorry,
well,
because
I
of white invisibility. How have we stopped you from doing that?
Right, the fact that you don't, I'm not saying like, give me your full story, but acknowledging like, yes, like obviously I can see that you are a white male, but that doesn't mean that you have to acknowledge that.
So your argument then is like, he has to put a little label, and when we put this label, it authorizes our speech.
I think you're
in some
realizing our piano camel evidence a little bit much. I think that you're understanding acknowledging as just like literally saying I am white.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
not
not
what
what
the
I'm
card
talking
says. Well, the card says that it's important for you to understand as a white male how your subjectivity necessarily precludes you from breaking down the systems of domination that you theoretically
Wait, does
adopt.
it necessarily preclude him from adopting?
Well, you have to prove why not, is the argument. I mean, I agree with you.
And so then I
Do you think we should?
Yeah, because the only alternative is to escalating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is the one? I feel like this is probably better than the
Oh, yeah. Actually, I think the other one's better, but.
You think so?
Yeah, that. Yeah.
Alright, I'm good. Shall I email or?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can hear it.
Okay, whatever works. Alright, so should I? Okay, can I get your email?
Yeah, it's HHS.
Wait, sorry. Alright. HHS.
KUAREZ 14@gmail.
See here. Wow. I like it. I like this idea. Alright. Let me know when you get it, if you get it at all. I'm good. Is it good?
I'm good.
statement. We can't use a strict ontology as a basis for understanding oppression. We can't use exclusion as a basis for the product of inclusion. The role of the ballot should endorse the best method for resisting oppression. The 1AC is all about the various modalities and differentiations within oppression, racial, class, sexist, heteronormative, but also the intersections between them. The way that Chinese women were only allowed to come to America as prostitutes, the way that railroad workers were forbidden from procreation because their babies would be white, the way that Latino and Latina Americans are consistently denied civil rights challenges on the basis of their so-called whiteness. The 1NC's verse and evidence are both correct. Writing is our political task. We have written and presented a method for political change. I think this difference between performance and method is important. Our argument is not that performance is bad. Our argument is that performance and method necessarily inform each other. We should, if debate has a sort of intellectual and pedagogical value, it should be a place in which we test strategies against each other, in which we make each other stronger through practices of mutual criticism and differentiation. I think that this is the point of our Prashad evidence when we talk about the need for a space in which multiple identities intensify against one another, a common movement of beginning against the forces of white supremacy that we both agree are bad, not just white supremacy, however, but the entire regime of faciality, the idea of masculinist, heterosexist patriarchy that overcodes our sort of relations to one another and to one another. This is important. It's whiteness, faciality, heteronormativity, masculinity operate by overdetermining difference into categories that can understand and control. This is our sort of argument about dyadic politics. Against this, we must affirm a basic multiplication of difference in the form of a pedagogy of polyculturalism and understanding culture as a complex series of articulations and interlocking sources of power rather than an essential set of identities that need to be included at the table. I think that this is specifically true of the way they've articulated the competitive, the sort of reason why you should vote negative. We precluded them from speaking their verse. We precluded Elizabeth from embracing poetry as a method for social, for sort of realizing her social location or relationality to various forms of oppression and structures of faciality that occur in the status quo. I don't think we precluded any of those things. I don't think anything about our performance, anything about our method necessarily means that they cannot do the same. I think that putting these two in contradiction is precisely what Rashad evidence says it's sort of the part and parcel of the divide and conquer strategy that allows the smooth functioning of faciality. I think this is divided by our coalitions argument. Boston cultural politics is zero-sum allows for facial ideology to divide and conquer and pit one group against each other. This is historically true of Asians, which is the sort of example. The 1AC against model minority men contributed to the dismantling of social welfare, affirmative action. White supremacist ideology insisted that historical redress would stop because it traded off with the needs of other groups. Against this, we have to affirm identity, cultural identity, racial identity, sex identity as fundamentally interlinked. Otherwise, these dyadic binaries, white, black, woman, man, gay, straight, etc., become a political technology for faciality to continue itself. The second argument is that in the face of other forms of oppression, when we insist on any binary, the black-white binary is the sort of example that Alcoff gives. It ignores that identity has multiple expressions and oppression occurs in multiple ways. It can't explain nativism or xenophobia, the idea that I don't belong here, the idea that I don't speak English automatically, sort of linguistic exclusion that's, I think, important here. The idea is that you can't explain settlers in the form of the extermination of native peoples, the appropriation of their land, the colonial history of the U.S., East Asia, modern fears of a rising Chinese war taking over the world. These all reinforce and inform each other, which means that any theory of cultural politics and identity that hypers over the multiplicity of oppression, the intensification of difference is doomed to fail. I think that turns a sort of solvency for their alternative, not because necessarily their politics was bad or the performance of the 1NC was bad, but the way they situated it in relation to the 1AC is problematic. And I think the third argument that they have conceded is this sort of affective resonance argument. Our Brady-Adi evidence makes a sort of, if you want to call it a uniqueness claim about the modality of affect in the status quo oriented toward mourning, the attempt to retrieve transformation from negativity. Part and parcel of the historical failure, you're left automatically assuming the white guy doesn't get a pass because, of course, whiteness cannot be redeployed, whiteness cannot be multiplied and differentiated in ways that are productive. Being against racism or being against oppression does not mean being against automatically everyone who is identified and identifies as white, male, or heterosexual. The only way to balance for transformative politics is affirmation, hope, rather than negation. We embrace the creative force of multiplication. I think this is especially true in the 1AC cross-sex. They say that material violence is inevitable. I don't think that should be the case. I don't think that should be the starting point of our politics to say that violence exists in the real world, to say that material violence and the degradation of humans exists in the real world does not mean we should not hold open the possibility for radical presupposition of non-exclusion. Saldana, my disagreement is not with the insistence on embodiment and emotion, but the reliance on a Hegelian notion of recognition to explain how they tend to treat white and non-white not only as a dyad, but naturally closed. There's little attention paid to complicated processes whose racial formations become the dominant. Faciality is not based on intersubjective dialectics and large world historical scope and abstract machine of faciality, reaches bodies in relation to power. Faciality invents new faces to capture deviant bodies, multiplying possible positions beyond any far, any binaries. There are thousands of encounters, facialities, imperialism, morose with Christianity, faciality became a matter of imperialist racialization in the face of the ordinary white man, and the first deviances are racial. Yellow man, black man, they are on the white wall of sanctification distributed in the black hole of subjectivity. European racism, the white man's claim, has never operated by exclusion. Racism operates by the determination of degrees of deviance, which endeavors to into a non-conforming trait, into increasingly eccentric and backward way, sometimes tolerating them, sometimes erasing them. From the viewpoint of racism, there is no exterior. The faciality machine will place all bodies in relation to the standard, measuring your acceptability through increasingly meticulous science to understand the intricate hierarchies of racism, a framework that allows for the gradual multidimensional deviances, preferable to a dialectical model. Faciality explains why after colonialism there is scarcely a place for left for any continent that everyone is facialized. You're American, the ways black continue to spread the white man remains the global standard, with the account of racism as a common phenomenon. It's the whiteness, is the norm, where it differs is the deviance is not based on a lack of recognition, negation, or annihilation of the other, but on a subtle machining, differentiation, and territorialization. The virtual structure behind facial formations don't look like a formal logic A, not A. Racism can't be counted with the alien civilization into the universal. I think that it's interesting that the main opposition to the absence and centering of Brad is a white man who's insufficiently interrogated his privilege. I think this is problematic for two reasons. One is it papers over my role as both the originator and scripter of this argument. It's important that we write ourselves into being. I think this is my way of doing that. We should point to the white man as a reason why that should not be affirmed. However, it's also an example of a sort of obsessive confessional rhetoric. Brad did acknowledge his privilege as a white man. He did say that we are all sort of fundamentally interlinked within machinic assemblages that cause forms of oppression to materialize and intensify, which I think is the entire point of our argument, that we are all embedded within each other's oppressions, and therefore we can't give up on the possibility of the interconnection. Their injunction to continue to confess more and more. What does it mean? Do we simply say we are white men, or do we have to go through a checklist of privileges, etc.? It becomes a politics in and of itself. The tell-offs of confession renders radical politics impossible. Smith and 13, in my experience, the plethora of anti-racist organizing project, I frequently found myself participating in workshops where participants were asked to reflect on their privilege. It was never clear what the point of these confessions were. It was not as if other participants did not know the confessor had privilege. It did not appear that individual confessions led to any other political project to dismantle structures of domination. The confessions became a political project themselves. The benefit seemed to be ephemeral. For the instant confession to replace those who had privilege would be in a temporary position of power to hear those who confess be granted temporary forgiveness. It was so cultural capital on those who seem the most oppressed. Consequently, people aspire to be oppressed, inevitably those with more privilege develop new forms of oppression for which they suffer. The goal became to be as oppressed as possible, as despite the cultural capital that was bestowed, these rituals reinstated the white majority subject capable of self-reflexivity. I think it's important here to center the question not that he exists as a white man, but we all sort of are embedded in structures of domination that we would hope to criticize and destroy at the very best, which I think is our argument for why we need to retrieve the possibility of affective transformation and hope. This sort of idea of collectivity, the idea of identity and difference as a constellation, the idea of the multiplication of different identities as a starting point for the way in which we can combat this sort of facializing structure that white male heteronormative politics creates. I think this is a reason for a permutation as such. That's not really what our argument is. It's more that you do you, we do us, and that we are fundamentally interlinked. This is our argument about affect. It's a constellation in which we are all fundamentally interlinked. The idea that we can fundamentally separate these two, that these two are mutually exclusive or in some way trade off with each other, is precisely the kind of divide and conquer politics that I impact turn above. Now, why does the ballot matter? Does the site for today become something different? I think this goes back to the question of performance first methodology and the importance of pedagogy and transfiguring the orthodoxy debate as a series of dialectical changes comes on the landscape of either or. You can write debate as different, a site where affirmation produces new modes of becoming other. Conway and Tech. The middle is by no means an average identification with pre-existing reference points, diminishing thought's power to lose to see between philosophical events of debate. A position pre-establishes inverse of debate is an issue. When someone identifies with this inverse terminological position, counterposition, contract to lose the middle, it gets thought free from close. The middle is becoming shaped and reshaped. Various conceptual routes it travels across. Becoming should not be confused with negation of the first term. Differences in becoming are irreducible to opposition or contradiction. Becoming not a matter of the first term, becoming equivalent to the second. Becoming is the construction of the first term. All right.
Are you ready? Why coalition? Well,
Why
your argument on coalition? Can I just?
Oh, sure. I mean, part of our argument is that we're kind of always already in coalition, in the sense that our oppressions are fundamentally interlinked, and thus we have what I call the 1AC how?
Yeah.
Well, a good example is perhaps like the way in which Asian American identity is deployed by the sort of dominant regime of faciality as effects on other minorities. I gave the example of the dismantling of social welfare, the dismantling of affirmative action.
So
these all have effects on each other, which means
minorities, but how does it link into white schools?
What do you mean, how does it make it work?
Like, they don't share the same assumption that.
You're right, but they also engage in it, they help intensify it, and I think they also can help resist it, which I think is the point of our affirmative. To cast the sort of white male heterosexual subject as fundamentally one that cannot be redeemed in any sense, I think is not a good starting point for our
Okay, so you talk about, I don't know your name.
Michael Brad.
Brad.
Right.
Oh, okay. So you talk about like Brad and like acknowledging privilege on like grouping and like grouping us in the same way during the 1AC and how he acknowledged privilege. Is that correct? Like I'm trying to.
I think, okay, so there are two arguments about how Brad acknowledges privilege. One, he literally did acknowledge his positionality as a sort of white male subject. The second is the entire argument that we're making is about the fundamental interconnectedness of all people and the way in which we are alternatingly complicit with and subject to processes of domination. Now, I think the entire argument is that he is embedded within these sets of relationships, which means, I mean, in a sense, the entire argument
My
is
question is
acknowledging
like
his privilege.
how does he how did he acknowledge his privilege on the fact that like Fiona Campbell is talking about? Like how did
Well, Campbell says, we should examine the context and location from which we speak.
right,
I
like we
think
should
the one is-
acknowledge our speaking or position.
Yeah, I think the one is, like I said, I think the one is he did that we might differ on whether it did, but like, I think our argument is,
What is faciality?
faciality is our sort of explanation for how oppression operates, not as a series of dyads, where it's like white, black, rich, poor, gay, straight, etc. It's as a series of maybe deviations from a norm.
Oh, okay, I'm just confused as to what faciality is.
Faciality is just that regime, that whole thing. Maybe we can call it the sort of overarching structure.
Yeah, it just had facial in it, so I'm just like not really sure if it has to.
Oh, well, I mean, that's just still is sort of like, he says that the original thing was the white man's face and differences in face, and that sort of got intensified, became differences not just in face, but in sort of mental capacity, in sort of ideology, etc.
You ever heard of Operation Big Boys for the Warrior of the agency 2 years ago?
Yes.
And we succeeded. That's great. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I just thought that was amazing.
Since we've been told that we pieces.
I just like at some point, just like very clearly.
Go on.
Just.
This is like
use like 9 minutes, so like
47.
Yeah, everybody ready?
What are you? Never stopped being a hard question to answer, even after all of these years spent thinking. How much time do you really need to think? To sit on fences, one foot in America, the other somewhere lost in Mexico, probably drinking the water like a noob, because you never knew what was going on. It's easy when you look in the mirror, you can discern the confusion, understand why your peers look so lost, yet so amused when you tried to explain why you cannot speak Spanish. Didn't your dad ever try to teach you? Didn't he want to pass you down his roots? Don't you want to grow up to be the man that God intended you to be? You are less than a man. You can't even make up your goddamn mind. You were uprooted from day one, navigating white spaces. Your white mom warning you of the dangers of marrying outside of your race because it's hard on the children. But what about this child with vague skin? Your mere presence asks a question. You are existential burden, provocative. No one knows what you mean. A mongrel. Speech acts can be inherently dangerous, which is why people in privileged speaking positions such as debate must interrogate their relationship to the oppressed and to declare their interests. That's Fiona Campbell. I think that Brad did the latter of this process, but not the former. Interrogating your relationship to oppression as a white male by flipping the burden on yourself to justify your existence in this conversation about interlocking forms of domination by discerning how your whiteness is inextricably combined with your maleness informs and prevents you from working within and outside modes of resistance. This is not so that you may feel bad and wallow in your privilege. Obviously, that's not productive, but this is it's really a question of, but if this is really a question of we are all in this together, it takes a little more effort than saying, hey, I'm a white guy, but I'm here to read the 1AC for my partner of color, which means I'm doing pretty well for myself and for you all. How have you specifically contributed to the hypersexualization of the Latina body, and how do you work through that shit? Pseudo references Latinas when he tries to explain our commonalities as people of color and how we are all in this together. But when he describes the way in which Latinas are denied citizen status, this is not responsive to the nuanced interrogation of the Latina body that Liz is doing in the 1AC. In fact, I think a lot of the negative performance gets lost in the 2AC, which is not surprising given that one of our link arguments is how so-called revolutionary movements that do not preclude, but do not forefront the lived experience of Latina women and women of color in general leads to their voices being crowded out. Because although you are right that us three debaters are debaters of color, we need to engage in a deeper interrogation of our own masculinity in the ways in which even within marginalized groups, women of color are continually spoken over and for. Voting negative is a process by which we can grant epistemic privilege to the Latina in a world where that privilege is not only actively denied and stripped away from her, but in a world where that privilege seems literally impossible. So excuse the line of questioning from the 1AC. If we are skeptical that being open to the possibility of shit working out for us, being open to the world rather than focusing on the self has historically not worked out for women of color, which is why the specific survivability claims that the 1AC is making is not only increasingly relevant, but absolutely necessary to affirm the existence of not only the Latina, but the complex and multiplicity of Latina experiences that Liz talks about. She is not the fiery, spicy Latina that is a product of the naturalized assumptions that occur and are produced not only through the media and things like pornography, but through day-to-day interactions. Our juxtaposition of our contradictory identities as Latinas is in and of itself a revolutionary mode of challenging essentialism like the app talks about. Because even though we are Mexican Americans, even though we are Chicanas, neither of us speak Spanish, which means we are constantly placed in a position whereby we have to always justify our ability to claim the title people of color. Are we really playing the culture? Are we really playing the culture right? Are we really able to speak to the claims of violence against people of color like us? Now they make an argument about how affect is a form of mourning. Is the argument mourning is bad?
Yeah, right. Our argument is that experiencing and reliving the trauma is an absolutely necessary process for Latinas to go through because they have literally never had the chance or the opportunity or the fucking time to mourn because they always have to constantly serve and constantly pleasure, but never pleasure themselves, never attempt to understand the ways in which they have inherent value, never ever get to a place in which they are able to produce a form of self-love. The revolutionary form of self-love that Middleton is talking about is different from a type of love that is encoded in the West, but is instead one that is decolonized, which is why the poetic investigation of the way in which sexuality and love is mapped out for the Latina body is a necessary starting point to understand the particularities of women of color. It's not enough for you to just talk about people of color in a vacuum because those power relations of masculinity masculinity absolutely must be interrogated when talking about Latinas. Now they make an argument about whiteness cannot be reappropriated. I'm inclined to agree in the sense that I do not believe that Brett would be able to use his whiteness in a way that would be conducive immediately for people of color. However, I do think that I am inextricably tied to whiteness, considering I am both biracial and half white, and grew up in a white suburban neighborhood where I felt neatly in line with white values and structures. Not only does this mean that I have to constantly overcome and work through my whiteness, but the fact that I am able to pass as white as a person of color, spitting knowledge that disrupts the linear modes of thought, is something that I can use as my advantage. I can reappropriate the ways in which I am marked white as a means to navigate and infiltrate white spaces and change that shit up, which is why your essentialist understanding of white, which means you have essentialized whiteness. You make an argument about why it's important for us to hold on to the possibility that I think this translates to hold open the possibility for white people to do well, since one of our main link arguments is the irredeemable nature of white people in the context of these movements. As a white man, it is important for as white man, Chris, it is important for you for your role, the judge, to defer to the woman of color in the room, precisely because they have never ever had that epistemic privileging, that flipping the script and forcing the conversation to occur on her terms is something that can literally never happen, which is why the academy is a privileged space, which only supercharges all of our arguments about why if coalitions are important, you need to put in a better effort to overcome the fact that we do not distrust you, that women of color specifically must engage in an automatic distrust of white men as a mode of survivability. Now, he makes the argument about the role of the ballot, right? He's talking about like method and performance are inextricably intertwined. Maybe that's true. I think the role of the ballot, however, that's the way it's framed, is kind of fucked up because it overemphasizes method. Yeah, you're right. You can't have one without the other, but your role of the ballot is one that prioritizes and places more emphasis on the method, when our argument is that tomorrow is not promised for women of color, which means we need to actualize modes of survivability. There needs to be a performative element by which we can not only disrupt the forms of oppression that are mapped onto our bodies, but also reclaim a form of authoritative agency. Authoritative agency. Poesis is the method by which women of color are able to do that. It's the process by which they are able to define their identity for themselves, rather than their identities being spoken over by the generalities and abstractness of the 1A seat. Now they make an argument about why it's important. So it's important so method should not be preferred over performance. In fact, I think that performance is probably more important than the method, because even if your method is not perfect, even if we can't fucking move mountains through our methodology, at least we are doing something in the face of that oppression, to uplift and motivate ourselves to even navigate through these forms of oppression, which means self-love comes first, because if we do not have the ability to even love ourselves and understand that we have inherent value, how could we ever expect ourselves to get out of bed in the morning to even navigate through those inevitable forms of violence? Maybe they're not inevitable, but at least they fucking seem so. So it requires a great amount of zeal and a great amount of energy and belief in yourself in order to even engage in these modes of resistance, which means that only the negative is able to provide that mode of survivability for women of color. You do you, we do us. You don't get to tell us what to do. I also think that this is pretty similar to segregation. If your argument is that it's important for us to operationalize together, we're all in this together, why should they be separate? I think that's a double turn. Obviously, we're making an argument about why, like, we gotta take care of ourselves and prioritize our shit. I'm just saying it seems like y'all turn yourselves.
All right.
So you talk a lot about the need to epistemically privilege the point of view of women of color.
Yeah.
What does epistemic privilege mean?
Epistemic refers to like epistemological.
No, I got you.
Yeah,
I just
so,
mean,
like,
what does that mean in this
Yeah,
space?
I know. It's just I literature again. So like epistemic privileging means like in the context of like debate to put emphasis and to sort of flip the script in such a way that conversations about domination and violence occur on the terms of the Latina, not on the terms of other people.
Why on the Latina as opposed to other people?
Well, I think in the context and specificity of this round,
Okay.
yeah, because this is about this debate and what our scholarship can produce in this debate in a world in which a Latina and a Latino are debating a man of color and a white man. It is important to understand the way in which power relations still operate and exist within that
In what way do
conversation.
those power relations, situate this debate space in a way that demands the epistemic privileging of the sort of Latino?
Well, I mean, I guess this is kind of a joke, but I guess I'm being for real. We're neg, so it's harder. But I think mostly
I know that
because
is kind of it.
yeah,
That's
but
reasonable.
but because like masculine, like because men are still more easily able to navigate through the realms of academia and are able to make more logical arguments because they are
Men
more
are
logical
able to make
beings.
more logical arguments?
Yeah, like when it comes to women of color, I am saying that women of color are posited as irrational. Is the argument I'm trying to make. Do you see what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
In what way, I guess,
Not to say that men of color are not, but when men of color and women of color,
I guess I agree in general.
irrationality still
We're
exists.
once again we're talking about the sort of specificity of this space. In what way do you think we have cast Elizabeth as irrational or anything in that sense?
I mean, I don't even think that question is relevant at the point.
You don't
at which-
think it's
Can I
important?
answer that question or through my own terms? The one in C, I think the moment whereby Liz talks about how there is no personal space for a woman of color. No space is hers. The academy was never meant for women of color, which means even if y'all didn't do shit directly, that shit still exists when we enter inside these spaces. Those power relations always exist. Acting like they don't, it's probably not good. It probably turns your back.
No, I guess I agree that these power relations always exist. Okay, well, that's fair. You say that performance is sort of more important than method, but then you describe poesis as a method and performance as a method.
Poesis is both.
Yeah, okay, I agree. What is the sort of like, so if they're both, we're both. So I guess what's the sort of,
Wait,
what's your
how
view
is
with
y'all
the
performative?
You don't think that in any sense we perform?
Well, performative not in the sense that y'all like didn't speak in like a way that was compelling.
What is
Performance mean doing?
We did something.
No, our argument is
Okay,
that
so
it's
your
a
argument
question
is-
of what the speech act does. You see what I'm saying?
So you think that the speech act in no way, our speech act in no way
I think
performative?
your two speech acts, the juxtaposition, as you all say, is complicated by the white privilege they said.
Start with poetry. Like on poetry form. Well, it's not a flow, but no.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. I made it in my own mind. We must be careful as long as we don't get in the way so that the world may spin right along while we are left to spin by ourselves. We live in silence, we die in silence on the street and the inside of ourselves. We were never meant to be pleasured. We exist only to pleasure and to obey inside and outside in between spaces. All spaces of no spaces is ours. There is no such thing as personal spaces for women of color at all within our lives because Latinas and women were taught to never discuss our personal problems outside of our homes, as the oppression is the problem. This is more than just a problem. This is a day-to-day trauma that many of us will not speak out against. because many of us are spoken for, because many of us are always afraid to speak. As Selena, the songs began of her life, will fall in love, that taught me to love myself, but actually falling in love is the way out, and it's not good, because all I've seen is that love will always be damaged than good. The fact that you need to extend and group all you need to first you need to group his arguments on poetry on the poetry debate, because he did some pretty damning mistakes and not engaging with the narrative part of the poetry. The fact he only talks about why he thinks that how the 1AC was wasn't had poetry in it. The fact that poetry is so good. The fact that he does not answer this is a pretty damning argument, because the fact that I talk about how it is key for women of color survivability and he doesn't engage is pretty fucked up, because it allows that women of color cannot always have agencies of their bodies and agencies on our bodies and a voice, and then he crowds them out by not talking about this, and it is a pretty damning problem. You need to extend the first Middleton evidence that I talked about in the 1AC that talks about poetry is key for women of color survivability, and the fact that it is, and he doesn't talk about like why it's why poetry is good for me, and he doesn't engage it right. It is key it is key. Poetry is key to tell our lived experiences for us, our voices, in order to be heard, because our voices were never ever supposed to be listened to. The fact that this is the reason why you're going to go negative is to allow women of color's voices to be heard, because poetry is not only that we can write shit down, it's the way that we can be remembered, it's the way that we can be heard, it's the way that we can always know that we have something to look back on, and that our lives mean something. And this is why poetry is a proof of my lived experiences. The whole poetry and the narratives are good and key together, and they intertwine, because of the fight of survivability that's breaking through the silence and overcoming and freeing oneself. Confines the conditions of history of poetry is not just a luxury for women of color, because women of color do not have the luxury to just write shit down, because they have to take that time and realize that they have to talk about things that matter and affect, so they can be remembered, so women of color can speak out and break that resistance. The fact that poetry is more than just more than what he is allowing. What poetry is, what he talks about. Poetry is more and more in depth on why that you should go on like it's a key to women's survivability to resist the actions of unrememberable. That Middleton talks about the fact that the AF doesn't recognize this is a huge mistake. And the neutrality towards women of color, whether internalized or not, is of our existence. Middleton, 2012. The acts of erasing or leaving out a root fast of literature work is the act of violence is given out that the impressions of not that they never exist, as will never exist, because there is no recordable, tangible evidence. When Chicana's women write down self-acts, expressions, and writing, and others like herself is saying that she feels or she is every time she puts down on a piece of paper of her words, and every time that those are read by another Chicana, and she is defined of worth by who they truly are and marked at are. The fact that this evidence talks about like why poetry is so inherent in the fact that they just erase this is pretty damning, because it allows us of who we actually are, and the fact that women of color should be heard, and the fact that when you need to extend that argument, that's the reason why that you should prefer the scholarship for Latino women, because we never get a fucking break in debate rounds and outside the debate rounds, because our voices are always blocked out, because people and men do never want to hear our voices. This is why poetry is such a key, because it allows women of color to survive in and outside of the debate space. And if your argument is that divide and conquer, the style of the after response is the white man participating in divide and conquer, that it will always be historically bad for people of color, but especially for women of color, because our bodies are seen as something to be conquered, so that white men can get pleasure. Our argument is that not that Brad matters to you, pseudo. Our argument is that you don't get to say saying what shouldn't get to be challenged in his position in the debate because it's disturbing. Discussing white men, the strategy, the survival, the strategy of women of color to masking whiteness because scholarship is tied to the body, which is the end of the day that you have to choose one form of scholarship over another. So you vote nay to affirm the Latino room in order to have the survival.
Okay, 20 seconds. Sorry.
You can run the rest of the
Yeah, no, right.
No.
That was just so uninspiring.
You start.
No, I just writing down.
We should speak from there.
I guess it is close, right?
It's in all ways a better, it's like we're sort of situated, you're directly across from everyone.
Want to make sure the camera.
Yeah, he just wants the camera.
Want a good angle.
I understand.
All my fans.
That's everything. I messed that up after I had to put it on. It's closed and cold.
I only brought this hoodie to this debate tournament. It was maybe one of the worst decisions.
Like, no, you should come to Northeast. Like, Boston at that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I was like, oh, I'm going down south. It'll be a little.
It's warmer in Boston.
But it is actually warmer in Boston right now.
It's cold as fuck in Kansas right now.
Yeah, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cold.
Pretty cold in Oklahoma.
Or vortex.
So cold is over.
I was looking for like some taste of fall too, but that never happened clearly.
You don't even know
Summer,
what fall
winter
is
makes
anymore.
sense. Winter's coming.
You know what other than that too?
Or either.
I was gonna say, I think winter's here.
It snowed on the way up, so I'm pretty confident winter is here.
See, another Lenovo computer just came in the room. You and these Lenovos.
We're talking
On the
computer.
window for something.
Yeah.
Listen, it makes them excellent laptops. Like, what's your deal?
I know. I mean, I just got one.
Oh,
Oh,
you're
okay.
pro
Okay, so
Lenovo.
you're like really excited. Yeah.
Count of the Lenovo close.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
I can now work for IG membership card. I was really excited for that.
Like, fix it up now.
You send something? No.
That's not the read cards. You're positive. Are you done?
Alright, is everyone ready?
It's the over under number of cards you've read when I got this game.
Wow, straight down.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, I
No, that's okay.
order is a little hailing.
Okay.
Alright. Okay. Thesis argument talking is a strict ontology for understanding oppression. The ballot endorses the best strategy for resisting oppression is key to turn the ballot into an object of becoming rather than being Chris. We're not going to tell you how you should identify by deciding you residence with us. You don't have to call Michael and I if you can. If you want, but the ballot is a sign we were engaged together in a new process of world articulation, what they call whiteness, which is primarily through dyadic forms of thought knowledge. You're not performing, but Latino identity or being white, natives and xenophobia, questions of loyalty, authenticity, all the examples in the Tweety don't operate along strictly binary lines. Our method can't cover that's the homogenized violence or the Tweety we're not. Talk we are engaging and changing the ways that various scripts and structure our identities. The only thing we ever hear is how we're unproductive, but our strategies are ways of affirming the hybridity of our appropriate identities in the face of heteronormative racist and sexist world. It's true that Michael and I are first very different family racial histories, but as Chinese American cis male, white European cis male, Lieutenant Harvard, Bastion, privileged and assholes, whoever there was, when the question becomes how we can leverage our subjectivity in politics, against dominant structures, our status as men, allows to avoid being anti-Latino stereotypes and violence. You all are right, we're statistically less likely to be in prison for minor crimes or hypersexualized by the media, but violence, transcendental racial sexual categories will it operates. What made intersection vectors which by black women, I can still be beat on the streets of Cambridge looking at a little too queer for Boston. That's one way of explaining why the story is meaningful for me too. I won't bury myself because that's performance. Redemption request for freedom. Let's not be a good white dude. I may not be John Brown, but not all white men are George Wallace, which is why multiplication is important to start faciality arguments. An abstract machine creates an average white man standard and forces ideas. From that point, there's no such thing as being right, whether there are historical ideals of whiteness, but those are challenged and dismantled by different strategies like ours. They've asserted a trans-historical structure to anti-Hispanic violence. They do not have evidence to support. Many voices are excluded in every space, like those who can't speak English in this one, but they can claim there's no space at all for women of color to be free to sort of tautological claim. It's a little disproven by this, when we're all taking time off to make our lives livable and talk about poetry again. You don't have to spin by yourself or be silent in this space. We're doing dialogue as best we can. We're rejecting hypersexual pornography. Scripts Liz and she's discussed oppression pretty well. It's a little reason to think that our politics is uniquely blocking not no three pieces of offense first. Is an affective resonance, the one that sees that's dialectical understanding of politics, women of color at the bottom of the oppression streams. You have to flip the script, but that maintains the existence of the script as such means antagonism. As the structure of political politics, racism, and mode and method comparison which blocks debate. Within a binary logic, you're either with us or you're against us. In their interpretation, you have to be anti-white, anti-status quo, anti-everything in order to be good politics. The poetry minority individuals has an emancipatory power, but it's also equally possible that these structures of liberals, we can reintegrate those distant voices, prove we live in a beautiful multicultural utopia, and as tools of violence against other groups instead of division. Our theory of competition is multiplication, which proliferate racist plant seeds, rather than tearing of roots that will never reach scholarships related to the body. The bodies aren't static, they determine themselves through their actions and their performances. Our politics is based on negation. Negation simply plays back into the history of critical theories, which assumes that negativity is good. Our point is that affirmation is mutually important because of Saldana and Braidati, evidence whiteness dominate. The insistence on static nature, on the fact that whiteness is good, whiteness is creativity, but theorizing those as inevitable simply makes that structure too total to destroy. Instead, we need to steal creativity back from whiteness. That's why Michael's sort of wrote this argument. That's why our argument is not that Latino women should not use poetry to reclaim their humanity. In fact, that's one of the ways that minority groups have defeated whiteness, by proving capacities used as tools as black authors did during slavery, which is why we resolve a lot of the reasons why their politics might be in the first place. Divide and conquer is the second impact racist. Machinic assemblage thinks it's not simply being phenotypically white or just being in power, which is have a negative understands whites and domination, rather institutions of power utilize specific kinds of individual weapons against other bodies. The model minorities a justification for destroying affirmative action in the straight body as a measuring stick of normality against queer life by maintaining an antagonistic understanding of real radical politics. It allows those structures to continue. We're not erasing your politics, we're also not the rainbow coalition, which the two men will try to clean us out. But coalitional relations are inevitable because all of us are locked inside of a social assemblage. We affect and are affected by each other. We construct a common world together. We construct a human. Each time we try to produce a common space like this, where the third argument is authenticity. There are two sides to this argument. The first is the white spotlight descent, which is dropped in the entirety of the block. It's made clear in the way. See, all the reasons why the app is bad are because I showed up to the party, which quite literally makes my invisible as its author and creator, and re-entrenches the notion that he's just my quiet subservient body belong to the white thrill ride. That is a unique form of in-round violence that they cannot outweigh. Second is the Asian white structure. There's a lot of reasons about why Michael isn't trustworthy as a racial ally, why he's using white tools to be a white guy. These are thinly veiled articulation of tropes of how Asian bodies are excluded from the American public sphere. Their politics defines itself on the exclusion of his entire mode of self-presentation. It's linguistic and xenophobic exclusions. As English is given his first language, they want him to break out the loud Sioux and read his little red book to prove he's justifying and being culturally authentic. But that's bullshit because it ignores how multiple people, multiple minority groups use white tools in order to challenge the system of broad. So yeah, the final argument is the permutation. There's no reason that engaging in a possible Latino poetics or requires a rejection of the affirmative notion of affirming a polycultural pedagogy as a mode of multiple racial existence. There was very little ink on this in the web block because you can hold the two-hour to very high standard. It could be a facet or false, but if it comes to the exclusion of other identities, it plays back into the power structure that or you don't have to join our anti-oppression club if you don't want. The debate is not a question of which of us is going to raise the flag best, but instead how we theorize those questions. So which means that the question of who you are it's not resolved by a simple ballot. The ballot's not a resolution just because Liz might be the least privileged person in the room by claiming that you should simply vote for that least privileged person. You affirm a classically liberal notion that paternalistic ballot is enough for a report to resolve past oppression. Now, the final argument is that they keep talking about how we're not engaging with their identities and their arguments, but it's weird because they've never once once talked about Michael's status in Asian America, they just call me a person of color, which is a generic sort of a way of sort of blocking out and making me invisible. I'm not sure what degree they want us to engage with Bliss's experiences. Should we deconstruct her potion? Should we go line by line and dissect and tell her why the metaphor of the spin was wrong? That doesn't make any sense. It seems dangerous. We won't try it. Do render the poem transparent because you're not. We have asked questions and attempts to draw connections between white and Latino Americans been disenfranchised by the notion that they are moving towards whiteness and thus aren't really getting badly enough to deserve equal rights protection. We've also talked about why affirmative action is destroyed because of hardworking Asian Americans who are used as tools against individuals with Black and Latin Americans. Also questions of how the border affects those Mexicans, Americans, Mexican immigrants, Chinese Americans, and immigrants, Chinese individuals who are separated by various things like linguistic differences, cultural barriers that are not simply a question of whether or not you are white and look white or sort of sound white and appear in a white space. These are all sort of complex questions. We are talking about their stuff, but they are not being us anyways. So that's the sort of do you will do us, what I think we're doing, but. This week,
Yeah, I mean, like, might as well.
Alright, y'all ready to do this?
One AR fails to grapple with two specific framing arguments that should shape your decision. The first is that the 1AC fails to extend the role of the battle, which means you have to refer to the 2NT analysis about why performance comes first. Because even if you have provided a theoretical justification and explanation about what could be done to move forward, that does not mean that you have done something to move forward in a world in which violence not only occurs out there, but within spaces like this, you have conceded that you have also conceded the role of the judge argument, which indicates that as a white man, it is important for you to defer to the woman of color, particularly because that in and of itself is a revolutionary act. Potentially, it is the only way in which a white person within this space is able to do something revolutionary, conducive to the contribution to liberatory scholarship that can uplift women of color, women of color. That is a process of flipping the script to grant epistemic privilege to the Latino body, which has always been crowded out from not only forms of academic and political discussions, but history in and of itself, which is why poetry is incredibly important. Now, the 1AR literally says nothing about self-love, which means that they have conceded a starting point argument as to how politics should be grounded when understanding how
how to move forward, which is to say that in order for us to be able to combat the sort of faciality that the 1AC is talking about, or the day-to-day trauma that Liz is talking about, it is important for women of color, those who are always told to never love themselves, but instead love the other men in their lives, and to be a submissive, and to attain to a submissive role, and that aspect of reclaiming some sort of authoritative agency to determine not only their value, but to determine the way in which these conversations get to take place. Because our argument is that because our argument was that. They never ever get to change the tenor of the way in which liberatory politics is constructed. Extend the argument that Liz is making about being neutral to a woman of color historically does not work out in a woman of color's favor, because she is very easy to cast off as a bitch that is giving you a migraine. She is very easy to crowd out, which is a reason as to why that epistemic privileging is absolutely necessary. Now they make an argument which is probably going to be pretty prevalent in the 2AR about why them doing them does not preclude us doing us. But I think the fact that you said you do you better than we do we is fucked up in and of itself, and only reaffirms a value judgment on Latina scholarship. The fact that a white man even gets to be able to have a say on the value of what Latina scholarship is, that it wasn't done well, it wasn't done as well as the affirmative is in and of itself the problem. Now they make an argument why it's important for so more on this whole trade-off argument. You are conceding the argument at the literal bottom of the 1R about how scholarship is embodied in that. In order to affirm Latina scholarship, you can't vote AF, because what Latina is on the AF team. It's a question of voting for the body and the words of the Latina, to not only to make sure that those words and those bodies exist and are heard, but to make sure that that writing and that scholarship is advanced. Otherwise, the hybrid performance of the affirmative that attempts to discern and investigate different types of structures will always come at the cost of Latina scholarship, precisely because you have to advance one team over another team, which is why it's a question of preferable scholarship. You don't have to win that you did something bad to us, just that the voting negative is a much more revolutionary act to challenge systems of oppression than voting affirmative. Now, you say that debate can be like a place for Liz to do Liz, in that it's kind of safe, but I don't think you get to make that determination about what space is safe for women of color. If a woman of color tells you that she has no personal space, and that no space is ever hers, then you should defer to her on this question. I think this is an in-round performative example about their unwillingness to defer to the Latina and their orientation and experience to the world, which is why poetry is in and of itself a better way to approach these conversations, especially when they come from women of color. Now, they make an argument about flipping the script maintains the script, but look, the script doesn't go away when you vote AF or neg. When we leave this room, the script exists. Identity is mapped and scripted onto our bodies as people of color, which means it's just a question of what our scholarship can produce within this space. Our argument is that the script exists now, it'll exist later, so we should use the script in the favor of the Latina woman, since she is literally always written out of the script, which is the reason as to why voting negative as a performative and methodological act is in and of itself a way of stealing away of power from the assumption that Latinas always have to fight for their right to speak. Now, you make an argument about the white spotlight dissent. Look, Liz answered this pretty well. It's not that Brad is more important than you, but you don't get to dictate that we can't place attention or focus on the positionality of a white man in a conversation about challenging forms of oppression. That there is an automatic distrust that is a result of the fact that the white man exists to conquer and alienate women of color. You don't get to say that she can't do that.
Does anybody here smoke cigarettes?
You said 7.
6:40 at this point.
Play it down. Yeah. Yeah, like how's it work? It's been working pretty good. You'll just kind of picture it as that. You can do it loose around on this battery, I guess, because I have to plug in it. So yeah, just like the flip side. Just not sustainable. I guess it's done now. I guess you get almost a whole round. They have it on for a while before that.
Just like stop the recording and turn it off during prep. You know,
But then you have like a bunch of different files.
that makes it better. Because then they're smaller. And transfer over faster. It makes it easier when you got edited.
Yeah, it's the problem is that people are trying to
That's true.
I agree.
so if you're like not standing right next to a wall, if you imagine it's like hard to,
I'll plug it in like there for charging.
then it's like hard to. As much as I love phones, you know,
Or might not mean anything.
No, Matt?
He's coming.
He's somewhere.
There it is. Sorry.
My flow.
It's really bad.
I don't think anyone's flow is particularly good in this debate.
Well, in this, cane cherry has the best flow.
It's pretty good flow. It's pretty good.
Okay, alright.
I'm good. Really quick. I'm good, right? Yeah.
The first question is how you should decide this debate. Our argument is that the judge must intellectually endorse the best strategy and method for resisting oppression. View this through the lens of the permutation. It's not mutually exclusive to say that we should talk about our political, cultural strategies in different ways of theorizing oppression and a sort of radical Latina coesis. These are the way these are mobilized, the way theory is mobilized throughout the debate space is performed practice, however, solely focusing on the question of performance of the theory is bad, something they've conceded. Performance is an over-determined theory. We want to put love in politics too, but there are lots of different kinds of love. Our argument that is that oppression fundamentally operates by the construction of strict dyads, along with violence people, black, white, gay, straight, boring, forward, woman, man. That's our faciality argument. Keeps these dyads in strict separation. Each other by reiterating a synthetic competitive dynamic between them. Any criticism of their advocacy has to mean that we're white or that we're silencing the one side has to win, one side has to lose, one identity has to be preferred, one identity has to be erased. This is the crucial distinction between our positions. The way they conceive of the ballot, this debate is some sort of Hobbesian war of all identities versus all identities. We enter the ring with our identities until one side wins, and thus their identity wins, is represented, and the other side condemns and silence. Our point is that this necessitates a divide and conquer strategy. This is not just a coalition argument. It's an argument about how essentializing differences of political technology of faciality that allows oppression to continue busting ontological positions that's fundamentally zero sum. Either I get represented or she gets represented is the fundamental, the basis of white supremacist ideology that allows us to pit one group against one another. That's historically true of the Asians, the sort of model minority myth that we return to over and over again, contributed to dismantling of social welfare and affirmative action, which insisted that historical redress be stopped because of trade over with the needs of other groups. This is the logic of the negative. We have to give epistemic privilege to the claims of women of color. But who does that leave out? In this case, it leaves out me. It's telling that they claim the Latina is the figure of absolute non-representation, but this entire debate has been about her coesis, where they haven't talked about Chinese or Asian oppression once in any speech, in any in the entire debate. Our argument is that we should work to eliminate privilege entirely instead of giving epistemic privilege to one side or the other. We have continually throughout this debate asked questions, attempted to draw connections between the way that Latino or Latina Americans have been disenfranchised by some sort of notion that they're moving toward whiteness, the idea of border crossing, the idea of affirmative action, etc., etc. I think I have to reiterate these because we've done this more throughout the debate, drawing connections between these two things. These are not zero sum. This debate doesn't have to be a question of whose identity is better or more oppressed. Debate can be sort of a way of affirming racial identity and cultural identity is fundamentally interlinked. The ballot can mean something beyond one more identity is more important than the other. Your ballot can be an endorsement of a political pedagogical space in which we embrace our survival strategies. Identity is mutually co-constitutive, where we call and inaugurate a new world into being that can help make the world livable for all of us. I think this is especially true of our sort of Conway evidence that the permutation shouldn't be seen as segregation. We weren't saying that we can do you better than you. We're saying that we can sort of create a livable space for everyone more effectively. I think the entire point is that someone always gets left out. If you voted for me, if you voted for them, if you voted for Brad, I don't even know. People always get left out. There's always an identity that's unthought. The argument is not that we should always seek to automatically privilege those that are left out the most, but how do we maintain attentive to that constitutive exclusion, which is the sort of basis for our politics and one that they do not even deal with. I think they've also conceded our, I don't know, you can call it an independent impact, where the privilege of women of color ignores that racial and sexual identity has multiple expressions. Racial oppression occurs in multiple ways. It can't explain nativism, xenophobia, linguistic exclusion, etc. The idea that I'm not a little citizen, it can't explain settlerism in the form of extermination of native people, the appropriation of their land, the colonial history of the U.S. and East Asia, this sort of effacement of queer politics and modern fear, a rising Chinese horde, etc., etc. There are all these things that remain unthought and more, which is why we shouldn't center this debate on the question of who gets heard more, or to cast a ballot, a sort of paternalistic ballot in favor of who gets oppressed more, because that fundamental competing hierarchy of oppression is precisely the political technology that faciality uses to disenfranchise us all. Now, I think they've also conceded the white spotlight DA. Their only answer is that we should be suspicious of Brad. Sure, we should be suspicious of Brad. Brad should have to prove himself. I think we have done that sufficiently throughout the debate when he talks about his sort of positions in white male subject, when he talks about the interconnectedness of oppression. The fact that they continually ask for more, that it can never be enough, is a sign of the the fundamental bankruptcy of their politics. There's no role for the white subject, which makes it fundamentally doomed. And I think that's a part of our Saldana habit, so we have to sort of think beyond the things that they say. Flip the script is good because the script is inevitable. The script isn't inevitable. The script never existed in the first place. That's our argument about dyadic thought versus faciality. It's not one continuum where white man is at the top and woman of color is at the bottom. It's a complex network, a constellation of identity and difference, which means that flipping the script doesn't actually flip it and reiterates the script that doesn't actually exist, which I think is our point. That's not to say the material oppression doesn't exist. That's not to say that people don't have lived experiences of violence and exclusion. It's to say that those are more complex than deciding one good, other bad. I think that it fundamentally disrupts most of their arguments about how you necessarily need to privilege women of color. We're not saying that we should silence, we should view debate as something other than the forced silencing of one side and the privileging of another, which is the sort of fundamental framing argument that they conceded. Now the poesis argument, yes, you're right, we agree poesis is a good political and cultural strategy. However, the question is how should we sort of affirmative as such. I think our affective resonance argument comes into play here. Something that the Schumann fundamentally concedes. We can't retrieve social transformation out of negativity. Poesis is good, but the way that they deploy poesis in this particular state, situated within the context of the affirmative, is a reason why we should lose for some reason, is necessarily the sort of negation of negation that fundamentally has contributed to historical failures of the left. Our argument is not that the content of their politics or their performance is bad, but how they have situated it in relation to other claims for voice, other claims for identity, how they've situated it in relation to the affirmative in this debate is something that we have an impact turn to that they have conceded.
Yeah, we're looking 1 second. Cancel Campbell. I'm probably gonna mess this up. Saldana.
Want me to email you?
Yeah, that's fine.
I got a moment. What's your email?
Yeah. CJ. VINC 08.
VINC.
08 at Gmail.
just like,
Yeah.
they're
I don't know that I actually got the emails.
forwarded.
So, will you just forward the emails? Will you just forward the emails, Sam? I never got them.
Andrew Lopez. 700.
Thanks.
No, I'm just walking.
Scrolling.
No, not scrolling yet. Just walking around.
So Joe P. I saw him walking around earlier.
Let's see.
right? That closed off process from occurring elsewhere. And so, that said, so I think part of the problem for me at the end of the debate is I think that you all spend a lot of time very early on in the debate on the privilege stuff. And I don't think you ever, so I look at the Campbell evidence, and so Campbell says that we have to have an ethical relationship, right, to interrogate relationship to subordinate people, and it is dangerous when we refuse to declare speaking positions, right? I think Bowman in the 1AC does declare his speaking position, and he talks about, he spends a good at least 45 seconds to a minute, in the 1AC, talking about how there's a juxtaposition of his identity, right, and his particular social location as a white cisgender male, right, in relation to Suo. And so I think that early on in the 1AC, you all are kind of behind, at least on the link level of this debate, and in terms of the privilege discussion, and you spend a lot of time on it early on in the debate, right? And so it becomes a large part that's not really getting you anywhere. And so I think they probably win that one. I think it ignores the question of whether or not Suo is the constructor of the scholarship, right? That is kind of the articulation, that is kind of the explanation of what it means to engage in that juxtaposition in the first place. And then I think that while not really heavy in the 2AR, which I think could probably be much heavier in terms of this part of the debate, it is at least somewhat there, right? Is that there's not really even if I buy, right, that it is necessary to talk about women of color, right, and I think they do that. I think they do a really good job interacting with the content of the 1ACs, right? I think they do a good job of explaining how multidimensionality works, etc. Right? The flip side of that is that there is this kind of rhetorical positioning argument about how you label Suo as a person of color instead of as Asian American, right? And I think those disconnect, those particular rhetorical moments are dangerous, especially when talking about privilege and positionality. And so I think that you have to have some contextualization of this. And I think you all should be spending a lot more time, I think Suo, you should spend some more time in the 2AR kind of exploring this part of the debate. And so at the end of the day, I think that the permutation probably resolves a lot of the criticism we want to see. And so I'm not going to keep rambling on. I think those are kind of the major framing things. And so even if I buy that poetry is a key to survival, I'm not sure that we want to see necessarily preclude that. And so I think you all have to do a little bit more work, some level of work, at least on the lead level, as to why the act, why necessarily that means the act scholarship is that, right? So even if I think your scholarship is good, and I do, right, I think you have to win that their scholarship is worse in some way. So, yeah. Any questions?
One of the issues raised was we're not engaging with the sort of poesis of the 1NC enough, but at the same time, I guess we're kind of about something where it's if we in large part agree with a lot of their method, what's the best way of essentially agreeing that poesis is good, but engaging with that a little bit?
I think that and I think the way he articulates this in the 1AR is probably the right articulation. It's we're not going to sit here and deconstruct your poetry and say it's not important, it's not valuable, right? I think the permutation already resolved a lot of that concern, at least for me at the end of the debate. And so I think you could still at least explode that a little more, right? It's we're not going to sit here and deconstruct. That's not productive, right? That is exactly what the divide and conquer mentality is. That's exactly how whiteness operates, right? And so it is probably bad for me to stand up in the 1AR and the 2AR and say your poetry is not important in this space. It is. But our scholarship is just as important in this space. And so at the end of the debate, right, even if I think the poetry is good, I need to know how to resolve that in relation to your scholarship, right? And so I think if you position it like that, it needs to be in the debate too. I think the 1AR articulation at the time.
Okay, so I guess really, the two questions. So the moment in the 2NC where I'm sort of talking about mourning is something that is important and necessary, and they conclude that by saying it's bad. I think that should have been carried over. Do you think that's an argument?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of those places that is not as big of a debate for you as it should have, because I think again this is kind of a application, right? You spend a lot of time on the privilege stuff instead of some other parts that I think are really good about the 1NC strategy. And I think if you explode that right into an hour, they have precluded mourning and they said we should never mourn, right? That is probably the way. And probably a way to link it back to the privilege stuff, right, is the debate, like, that is a form of policing, right, of like what it means to affirm, the Latino woman, right, at the end of the debate, right, and so, like, that is their preclusion of mourning, right, mourning as a necessary survival strategy, mourning is something that is necessary for us to do. They have precluded us from doing that by saying it is not productive, it is not valuable, and I think if you talk about some of the ways in which they characterize those parts of the debate, right, then it makes an easier debate as to like why maybe the permutation may not even resolve this at the end of the day, right?
Do you think that like a more hardline stance about like why white people are irredeemable would have been good in this debate? Because I sort of feel like the app sort of is like hope for white people to an extent, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think you could stand up and say give white people too much credit. White people always do stuff that shit.
Yeah.
Right? And they always will, right? Which is why this debate is necessary in the first place. And there's a whole room full of white people, right? And so they probably are going to leave here and do some other shit anyway.
Yeah.
Right? And so how does the 1AC resolve that? It allows white people to have an outlet for saying, oh, I'm a good white person, right?
Yeah, but I guess like in the way we sort of went about it was a privilege argument, and like yeah, I totally agree, like that wasn't strong. But like how else do we go about that argument?
I think you position it in terms of like, I think I would ask them like, so like instead of these like explicit, like you don't talk about your positionality, right? Which is kind of the way the articulation is, which is exactly how the articulation is of the privilege stuff. You should be like, what does it mean to juxtapose yourself in relation to pseudo, right? What does it mean, like, what does it mean for a white person to engage in the scholarship of the 1AC, right? Are white people good? Can they ever do good things, right? Like, there is a ton of literature out there that says white people will always do bad things, and whenever given the opportunity, right, like they will mediate themselves of responsibility.
And I had like, in my toolbox, we got arguments about like why anti-racists are bad, but I think it's just like, I don't think that we can like necessarily frame the 1AC, it's just like white anti-racist movement at the point in which like pseudo is like inextricably tied to the scholarship.
Yeah, I think you do your one, right, like, but I think then there are probably questions to be asked about why if pseudo is the constructor of the scholarship, why is he not the 1AC, right? Like, there's a question of like, why did he allow Brad, right, to stand up in the 1AC and read his scholarship?
And do you think that we could just be like, that means that the white person initiated the conversation?
Yeah, or even if, like, yeah, because they're probably going to make arguments, right, that, like, he's probably still going to make the same arguments, right, like, I am the constructor of the scholarship, right, but, like, at the end of the day, right, he has been the one that has read the 1AC, right, so that conversation has been filtered through the lens of a white man, right, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so because it has been filtered through a white normative lens, right, and it has been filtered in a white normative lens in multiple ways, not just of who is reading it, but right, how it gets read and how it gets filtered onto the flow, right? And so those type of arguments, right, are necessary in order to like talk about the positionality of privilege, not necessarily like you don't talk about it.
Yeah. So when it turns about like cohesive speaking, and you're talking about how like it's filtered through like white normativity, do you think that we could be like the style in which they read the 1AC is white normativity?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right, like that is what your literature, like, who is it? Middleton.
Yeah.
Like that's exactly what Middleton invites, right? It's like that poetry, like, is rooted in our experiences, right? And those are necessary things to survive. Why is the 1AC necessary in order to survive? For me to be there, right? Like, and I think, right, because of the way it's filtered and processed and delivered, suggests that it is probably not as necessary for survival as for someone else. Right? And so, other questions?
Thanks a lot.